Boy, just like rain down out of the sky. So we flew over there and got in the fight, and we shot down 8 of them. All that happens fast, you know. You're scared, but you're not panicked. See, that's the difference right there. Yeah, and anybody that says they aren't scared, they're useless, because anybody that is any good at all gets scared.
In 1944, when the 354th Fighter Group introduced the P-51B into Northern Europe, the tide of the air war turned decisively against the Luftwaffe. At last, the Allies possessed a long-range air superiority fighter whose capabilities matched or exceeded every enemy fighter. While the P-47's major weakness was its slow rate of climb, the Mustang climbed like a homesick angel and dived with the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. With no major weaknesses, the P-51 became the best all-around air superiority fighter of the war, at any altitude.
That caught the Germans flat-footed there for a while. They really give them a bad time, because the 51s, he'd catch the German air force in the air, and they'd drop those tanks, and then they'd cut them to pieces, because the 51 could outturn the Messerschmitts. So they made out real well there.
By war's end, the nature of the air war had evolved into a brutal struggle for positional advantage. From the early days when the Germans were able to dominate the RAF with their sleek 109s and their deadly hit-and-run tactics, newer Allied aircraft arrived in time to change the fundamental nature of the air war. While retaining their edge in turn fights, Allied pilots enjoyed unparalleled flexibility with the late generation of fighters and could fight the Germans in vertical hit-and-run style and win. Such flexibility spelled doom for the Luftwaffe's fighter force by 1944. While different tactics could help offset the advantages an enemy may have in aircraft quality or quantity, there were some basic elements to air combat that always remained a constant. Mastering them took time, something that fighter pilots in World War II didn't always have.
During World War II, American pilots used to say, "Fly 5 and stay alive." And what that meant was, if you made 5 missions, if you flew 5 missions and you were still alive, your chances of survival through your entire tour just went up exponentially. The reason for this was something that later was called situational awareness. SA was basically the ability to process all the information going on around a pilot in the midst of an air-to-air engagement. And developing the sense of situational awareness needed for survival in air combat took time. If a pilot could fly 5 missions, he'd have the experience needed to really understand and process the things that he saw. But before that point, he had no concept of what was going on around him. Frequently, pilots never even saw aircraft around them in an air-to-air engagement, and even more seriously, they rarely saw the aircraft that shot them down. As a result, it was the inexperienced pilots that made up the brunt of the losses through the entire Second World War.
Dogfights are funny things. They're huge. They might go all over the sky. You lose track of your own people. Hopefully your wingman stays with you. If he doesn't, then you're in trouble, because you not only have to watch what you're doing, you have to watch behind you. People who don't check 6 are in deep trouble. If they won't be victor, they'll be victim.
Sighting the enemy has remained the single most important element to winning any air-to-air engagement. Once the enemy had been sighted, keeping them in sight was always critical to winning the battle. Another fighter pilot proverb of the day ran, "Lose sight, lose the fight." Without knowing what the enemy was attempting next, a fighter pilot could not select the maneuver needed to counter it. Again, that was why so many inexperienced pilots went down. They simply could not see or process all the information unfolding around them. Sometimes, if a pilot lost sight of the friendly aircraft in his flight or squadron, they could be almost as hazardous as the enemies in close-range turn fights.
one of my very first sightings of an enemy aircraft was a 109 who crossed in front of me. I turned and got headed towards him in a steep bank left, and all of a sudden he started coming apart, and I hadn't fired my guns yet, and it was Glenn Eagleston coming in from the other side had hit him. Glenn used to tell me all the time, "I owe you one." He says, we almost were air scoop to air scoop when he finally hit him.
If a fighter pilot could stay alive long enough to learn some of the key lessons in air combat survival, he could become a very valuable asset to his squadron.
During the war, to be a successful fighter pilot in air-to-air combat, you needed a couple of basic ingredients. The first was eyesight. A successful fighter pilot had good eyesight and could spot enemy aircraft at long ranges. The second was the ability to fly his aircraft to the edge of its performance envelope. Basically, he needed to be a good pilot. And kind of as a corollary to that, he needed to understand his aircraft as thoroughly as possible so he could get the most out of it. And that really came down to a number of hours that particular pilot had flown in the fighter type he was taking into combat. Lastly, he needed to have a thorough understanding of the tactics that would maximize his aircraft's potential and capabilities in air-to-air combat, while at the same time negating some of the advantages the enemy aircraft possessed over his own aircraft.
Air-to-air gunnery was and still is a true art form that only a select few ever really master. Dick Bong, America's ace of aces, spent his first months in combat unable to hit anything except from practically dead astern. Later, after undergoing extensive gunnery training in the States, he returned to combat and became an incredible aerial marksman, hitting targets from virtually any deflection.
Deflection shooting was the ability to take out a target from different angles relative to that particular target's direction. So firing from directly astern on an enemy plane was called a 0-degree deflection shot, while shooting from a 45-degree angle from behind was called a 45-degree deflection shot. The most difficult shot was the 90-degree deflection shot, where the shooting plane was perpendicular to the target aircraft. That required the most amount of lead and the most amount of calculations in the pilot's head to actually hit the target. Deflection shooting was actually an art form. It was very difficult to do, and there were very few pilots who were really good enough to hit a target from anywhere except dead astern. So those that were able to do it really had very high scores. Renee Funk was probably one of the most famous deflection shooters in aviation history. He was a World War I French ace with over 70 kills to his credit. During World War II, some of the great deflection shooters were Hans-Joachim Marseille, who was a German pilot who was renowned for his ability to bring down very rugged aircraft like P-40s with 7 or 8 shots. He was that good of a marksman. For the Americans, probably one of the best deflection shooters was Tommy McGuire, who had 38 kills and was the second-ranking American ace in World War II.
Through much of the war, Americans relied on fixed reflector gun sights. At first, the standard K9 gun sight was used. Later in the war, however, the United States developed a computer gun sight known as the K-14. With the help of a gyro, it would compute the lead required to hit an aerial target.
We had a K-14 sight that was a gyro sight, and you put